if you only in education test for the test and test for the memorized knowledge, but you don't test, other things, other behavioral and emotional things, you don't really know the student, and you don't really know the trajectory of their learning. But if you build all that into it, you're much better at foreshadowing and predicting and understanding when that student's needs are there above and beyond to be filled with more information.
Learning to swim is about learning from others. Be the author of your own story, not a character in somebody else's story. Get inspired by others to take action. Learn how to set goals to exceed your own expectations. So often the answer that you are looking for is right in front of you. On Learning to Swim, we highlight those answers through storytelling. I want to welcome Scott Brandon to Learning to Swim today. And Scott has just an incredible resume and is such an interesting human. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. Welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Honored to be here.
Oh, terrific. Well, you have, and I don't know that I'm going to get all of the pieces, and so we'll fill in as we can during the conversation, but you were, it's fascinating. You did 25 years as the executive director at the Lincoln Center. You are also the director of, I didn't ask how to pronounce it. Litróf Consulting, and president of Trade Inc. And what I really love is you developed the Imagination, Creativity, Innovation Index, and you have also been involved with schools, and you have had these different conversations, and you're an author, so we'll talk more about that. But I love these imagination conversations that you've had. So one of the things that we talk about a lot on Learning to Swim is the connection between resilience and how we think about failure and the role that creativity plays in continuing to expand and grow us as people and also as organizations. But if you would, I feel like when you and I were talking informally, one of the things that was so illuminating was the idea of imagination kind of preceding that creativity and innovation piece. So will you speak to that a little bit more?
Sure, and I'm going to reference my book. Oh, no, it's not here. But it's called Imagination First. And it was named that for the very reason what you just said, is that we worked off the premise that all business leaders prize innovation, because it's the outcome, it's the monetized outcome of the action. And of course, that's what they prize, because third quarter profits, shareholders, everybody wants that third quarter profit. They want it to look good. People's, salaries and bonuses and everything's based on it. But you can't pray at the altar of innovation and get there. You have to, in our view, you have to backward map it through creativity back to imagination, thus the title Imagination First. So if, just for the sake of clarity, to me, imagination is the capacity to think of things as if they could be otherwise, to ask the what if question. It's pre-action. It's perception-based. It's how we take in information, how we process information, how we come up with the beginning kernel of a nugget of an idea. Creativity is using the formal language or elements of a discipline, whatever the discipline is, to do something constructive. So if you're an architect, it's using the language of architecture and design. If it's a doctor, using the language of healthcare and medicine. And each of those has a practice or a way of doing things. But just because you're creative and you're doing something in a creative way, it doesn't mean you're imaginative. And it certainly doesn't mean it's going to lead to innovation, because innovation is the productive outcome of imagination and creativity. So just because you're creative, people do creative things all the time, bless their hearts for doing it. God bless them. It's great, but it doesn't mean that it's innovative. And we prize innovation and entrepreneurship because that's what pushes the form or changes the business and gives us a strategic leg up, so to speak, against competitors and on and on. So you've got those three. My argument is you have to start with imagination because that's how you get to that kind of culture, that habit of mind, that way of thinking and acting that we all want. But if you go to Harvard Business School or any of the business schools, you'll see in the case studies, case study after case study after case study of businesses that say they want this. It could be a school, by the way. It doesn't even have to be a business. They say they want something, but they don't quite know how to get there because they're not creating the culture. They may be creating some of the rudimentary elements, and that's good. There's nothing bad about that. But just moving the commissary or giving people a motivation to interact doesn't necessarily create it. You have to be more conscious and deliberate than that, in my humble opinion. So those are the terms, and that's what the work is really based on.
So let me ask you, because there is, I think, an interesting conversation when you think about creativity. And I feel like now I'm expanding my definition to also, or thinking about it to include imagination of kind of in the box and out of the box. That's another thing that a lot of companies or corporations or whatnot will talk about. Oh, we want out of the box thinking.
Yeah,
I
they
know.
don't. They say they do, but they don't.
Well, and also, I was reading something recently, and it was talking about how important in the box thinking is, so that, and you were talking about, that people do creative things every day within these different disciplines, and that there is kind of this language and practice. But where does imagination fit in? Or maybe it's a different place, but in that whole conversation around in the box and out of the box thinking.
Well, in imagination first, what we did is we interviewed some 70 thought leaders and names you would recognize, thought leaders. And we took from their conversations and extrapolated or kind of pulled out 28 and a half, to be clever, practices. And the reason we called them practices is that we wanted to make the argument, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. How do you become imaginative? Practice, practice, practice. That it's a doable, because it's who we are. It's part of our DNA. It's either nature given or God given, however you view it, but it's part of who we are. So the question is, how do you develop it? Not do we have it or not, which kind of takes us out of the nature nurture question. You're either born with it or you're not. You are born with it. We're all born with it. It's really not unlike language, what you do with it. So how that gets developed moving forward is always the question. So when you use the terms within the box and outside the box, we came to the conclusion that most of the time, and I don't want to say all the time, but most of the time, when people are saying think outside the box, what they're really saying is don't think like everyone else. Refresh, that perspective, come up with something new, which is good. But what I believe, not to get lost in semantics, but what I believe is more often than not, we're talking about thinking inside the box. Because businesses, society, laws, they're all containers, they're all constructs, they're all containers, and that's a box. Anything that contains you is a box. So if you just decide you don't want the box, what are you relating to? Are you relating just to yourself and your own perspective? Are you relating to a set of abstract theories? I don't think that's what most businesses really are saying they want. I think what they want are people who fully understand the box, but understand the box is malleable. The box can be changed. The box can be moved in different directions, because then it's kind of contained in process-oriented change. It's not change for the sake of change. Maybe if you're being a disruptor and you're going into your garage and you're creating a whole new technology, and you're throwing everything else out, which I don't think happens very often, by the way, having just moved back to Arizona from 4 years in Silicon Valley. I don't think that's what most people are doing. I think they're thinking inside the box, but they're thinking inside the box in a constructive, moving it toward a new innovative culture and a habit of mind that goes with that forward. Because once again, I just don't know a lot of business leaders that really are saying, oh, forget about all that structure. We don't really care about that. What we want are just good ideas. Now, most of the time they say, we've got so many ideas, we don't know what we're doing. We don't know what to do with them. And make sure it helps the bottom line.
Yeah.
And that's thinking inside the box. But thinking inside the box is a really great place to be. There's nothing, that's the beauty of it, is that, it almost sounds like, well, if I can't think outside the box and I'm thinking inside the box, I must be a little bit narrow-minded and not as adventurous and no, I don't believe any of that. I believe it's really the harder work.
Oh, I absolutely, when I read about that and thought about it more deeply, it is very much in alignment with my experience in the real world, and also my relationship to how I've come at thinking about things differently, or being creative and imaginative and innovative, all those things. So
and that was apparent, by the way, when we spoke informally last time. That was one of the things that was really encouraging, was that you already get this. By the way, that means we're not necessarily the best examples for the change variable here, because we already get it. We're already predisposed to think this way, which doesn't mean that other people are not, or they're bad, or they not as intelligent or capable. It just means that there's something in our lived experience that's allowed us to ask these questions in this way, which is great. But the real question of how to develop all this is the person who hasn't had that thought yet, who isn't there yet, because they're the typical, in the best sense of the word, the typical client.
Well, and so how do you see, so let's talk about failure a little bit. That's one of those concepts that is, that right now, and it's always about, let's fail forward, fail, up, or, how great of, that's where if you're not failing, you're not learning or growing. And I believe all of that to be true. Absolutely. I've seen it play over again and again in my own life. And yet, it is in the moment, depending on the scale that we're talking about, it doesn't feel very good. So do you think, I guess where I'm going with this is, part of that cultivation of imagination and then possibly thereby creativity, is there any correlation to your experience with failure and how you ultimately experience it? And
yeah, it was another one of the 28.5 practices that came out of the interviews. We call it failing well. And so this was 12 years ago, when we wrote this, or so. And it was, without a doubt, a lot of people talked about how important it was, to fail well, fail smart, fail forward, as you were saying. I guess my caution or my question within it is, experience for the sake of experience is not always the best experience. They're said differently. As long as you have some purpose and some conscious behavior and there's action and accountability, So I would add to anything that I talk about, anything that comes out of something that I'm involved with, I want there to be a really concrete set of outcome actions attached to it, because that's how you keep it grounded. It's it creates its own accountability measure because you can look at it. And I as you said, I was at Lincoln Center. I like to joke that they let me out after 25 years for good behavior, by the way. Which was a great job. It was a pinch me job, an amazing place to work. I loved going to work every day. And tragically, not that many people can say that, especially for 25 years. Yeah. But failing well is something that's that is just part of the lived experience of work and of life itself. Big and small, tragic and not as tragic. As long as, I used to tell my staff all the time that if our actions are always not to prove and disprove, but to always improve what we work on, then we're kind of holding ourselves accountable to a higher measure, and that higher measure is it leading to improvement? It's easy to prove or disprove because you're not, argue till the cows come home over things. At the end of the day, who cares? If the real question, did it improve something, either the bottom line, the work environment, the set of values that it's based on? And I would also add to the failing well, and I know this is hard for businesses to think this way, but the more you can build your own disruption into your own business model, the better off you are, because after X number of years, you're no longer the avant-garde, you're the status quo. And everybody's then eyeing for you. And if you don't keep changing and evolving your own business model, because you're prepared to do it, not because you're forced to do it by other, you're not failing well. You're failing.
Well, so how do you? It's a simplistic question for, I'm sure, a very depending on the circumstances, there can be so many different ways that this happens, but how do you build disruption into your own system?
One, by not being afraid of people's perspectives. My experience in organizations pretty large and pretty small is if you listen to the vibrations on the ground, you really will pick up what's going on. If you only listen to the vibrations in the boardroom, you may not. If you only look for third quarter results, you may not. But if you're, I'm working on another book, I don't know if I mentioned it last time, but it's on imagination in the modern marketplace. And my thesis, my argument is the modern marketplace started during Silk Road in Constantinople, modern day Istanbul. And if you've ever been, it's the place where Europe, quite literally Europe and Asia come together by landmass, still named that. The Grand Bazaar is one of the great marketplaces of the world. But if you go back and study, which I did, what went on during that period, you start to realize that, it's transaction, we bartered, we exchanged things, but more or equally as important was interaction, what we learned from each other, how we became behaviorally more attuned to each other. If you build that interaction into that transaction, my argument is in this imagination, creativity, innovation kind of strategy, you'll start to be aware of those, those disruptive needs and tendencies because you're paying attention. You're not just paying attention to, you're paying attention to people and environment and culture, not just transaction. It's akin to if you only in education test for the test and test for the memorized knowledge, but you don't test, other things, other behavioral and emotional things, you don't really know the student and you don't really know the trajectory of their learning. But if you build all that into it, you're much better at foreshadowing and predicting and understanding when that student's needs are there above and beyond to be filled with more information. Because that's the complexity of the marketplace. It's the complexity of learning, is that we're we've got these elements that have to go together. And my experience is if you build enough of that in and ask good questions, ask good Socratic questions, and once again, not be afraid of the answers, because, if your team is telling you what the customer is telling them, but you're only hearing what what a limited number of voices are telling you, I wonder who's out of touch in that environment. And tragically, that's all too common, tragically.
So what is your, we are living during COVID at this moment and speaking during COVID. So I wonder, because I've heard, we've got a few different things happening within organizations. We have a very, we've got a lot of people still working from home. We have a lot of, work being done remotely, meetings being held remotely. So there is a kind of there's a disconnection in some ways. And then conversely, I also, in my conversations with folks, have heard that, one of the great things about doing the work from home and the Zoom from home is, we are getting these windows into kind of the person as a whole a little bit more so, and that there may be even kind of more interaction happening amongst teams and team members because you don't have that spontaneous running into each other in the hallway. So do you have a sense of, 5-10 years down the road, when you talk about being able to really listen to what is, the rumblings on the ground, is this moment, do you think it's hurting us more so, or is it helping us, or is it a little bit of both? And do you feel like it's going to lead in one direction or another?
Yeah, the easy non-answer is yes. But I don't know if you saw today that Zoom as stock took a big hit today because of the announcement of the COVID vaccine.
Right.
That's a really interesting market indicator. Not sure what to make of it yet, but it's an interesting market indicator that one of the things that helped us most get through this took a hit by the very thing that will help us get through it.
Right.
So it's an interesting, at least for me, an interesting juxtaposition of change meets change meets change, and how does one influence the other? But when I was at Lincoln Center, we got involved with distance learning maybe 20 years ago now, where we did fiber-based distance learning with schools in the metropolitan area. We also then did an online course with the Darden School at University of Virginia and a company that was doing case study based learning. So we created these online structures, and myself and the staff, the key staff, we didn't really believe it was going to work, because we said, no, nothing like the real thing, nothing like this, in the best sense of the word, the sensual experience of being in real time and real place with others. You read each other in ways that it is harder. This is a two-dimensional experience. It's instead of a three-dimensional experience, there's stuff I can't see either because of lighting or because that, we just don't take as much data in about it. But I went into it asking myself, instead of saying, is A the exact equivalent of B, and therefore is A better than B, or is B better than A, is A significantly different, or is B significantly different than A? And if so, are those attributes better, attributes that lead to newer things and other things? And that's what I came to, because if you try to judge them just against each other, I'm not sure you're going to come up with the right comparison. But if you start to say, what does one bring to the table that the other doesn't? If you're asking me in a perfect movie world, what I would create a combination. The value of the online is you can reach people at a nominal cost in both in time and real money, because time is money for most businesses, let alone travel cost money. Takes you out of the office for at least a day, if not several days. If it's extensive travel, it wears you down and out. So there's, there are a number of benefits of not doing that, but there's also a number of benefits of doing it. So in the perfect movie world, I would try to design things that are combination of, but my biggest fear, and you mentioned, something that we're working on, imagination conversations, which we can talk about more. We're putting together this world-based, this global-based series of conversations between thought leaders, cross-sectoral, with the idea that using the question, who influences me, and what kind of thought comes into my daily life to influence me. And we were originally going to do them across the globe in person with a virtual kind of way of sending it out to numerous others. So more for the distribution side rather than the presentation side. Because of COVID, we can't, and it's allowed us to rethink it. We're going to be doing a beta test, an alpha test of it in a couple of weeks with people from 6 different parts of the world to see what it's like if you have these events, these thought-based events that are virtual. But the part that makes me most nervous is the next step part. I'm a big believer in what I call the Friday afternoon, Monday morning conundrum. Is we go to things Friday afternoon, we get jazzed. We go to an event in person or virtual, and we hear all these things and we leave, and we're jazzed to do stuff. Come Monday morning, we forget 80% of what we talked about, and we're 20% too damn busy to do much of it anyway. So my point is that just because it's talk, it doesn't mean it's action. And the only way it's going to lead to action is have people on site, because change, from my humble opinion, once again, is still local. So you need people there. So if I do a virtual event and I'm in my home and you're in your home or workspace and everybody else all around the world is, we're not going to do much on Monday morning as constructively, because we really do need to get together to share a whiteboard. You can do some of it online, but there's a point where I believe you have to then start to do some of that ideation, some of that developmental work in person, because you literally need to be building off each other. So that's my one fear of it, is the action outcome side. But from a conversation and presentation, I don't see any reason why we won't do it. The bigger question, which I know we've touched on, is what's that mean for learning? What does that mean for K-12, K-16, K-18 education? Because that's an entirely different conversation, because especially for younger kids, so much of learning is social. And if you're in your own home with your own family 24/7, that's not taking you out into the world and helping you prepare in that way. And that's the bigger concern I have. Even in college, it's a social experience, sometimes too social, but a social experience.
Yeah, I would agree that it's, yes. And I think that my concern, to just even, to add to it, is, recently, because of sheltering in place and also being safe, given the guidelines, we are tending to silo even more so. And that's one of the things that I think, that we didn't realize the value of those spontaneous interactions that we would have as we would go out into the world. And so that's one of my big concerns is I feel like I was already seeing it, whether it be in entertainment, the fact that, or, you know, media, that there's just so many different outlets that it's, you know, you pretty much can, you know, just focus on the one that is saying exactly what you want to hear. And again, kind of just spending time with people that are already in your bubble, and now the real within your bubble. And you know, it's I had a client and we were talking about how great it is, you know, to go to places like the grocery store or whatever, and that those are those moments where who knows, who's going to be there, or even a, you know, a sporting event, which although, you know, generally most people are there in support of one team or another, you don't know what the outcome is going to be.
I quite agree. I think those are necessary and invaluable. I think the truth is, I don't think anybody really knows what post-COVID is going to be like. I think we all hunger to get back to, you know, normal, but, you know, normal is what? You know, I don't know. I mean, I don't think anybody really knows. I think, but I do hunger for, you know, I started the imagination conversations when I was at Lincoln Center. We did 60 of them, reached 12 or 8 million people around the country, 42 states. They were sponsored by governors and business leaders. This new iteration that will be global. I started it based on the question of who influences me, which is your silo, you know, statement of, you know, right before COVID hit, I looked at my LinkedIn and said, well, LinkedIn's my kind of modern day Rolodex. You know, it's as close, since it's a professional site rather than Facebook and others, which are more interpersonal sites. And I looked through my list, and at that point I had about 2,600 people on my LinkedIn, and I asked the question, who influences me? And I took a look at that group, because that would be my influencers, my tribe, you know, my group. And, you know, it was a great group. You know, there's no doubt, you know, I knew some wonderful people internationally, but not diverse enough. And if you use all the variables of diversity, not just gender or age or any one or two of them, you really try to factor it to be able to say, what's influencing the way I think, what's influencing how I perceive, how I make decisions. And I made a decision. I've always been fascinated by the concept of 6 degrees of separation. I loved the play when it was at Lincoln Center, but it's, you know, it's a great concept that you know somebody that knows somebody that knows somebody that knows somebody. Between us, we're going to know everyone in the world using 6 degrees of separation. So I went and I looked at my then 26-ish hundred people and said, how am I going to grow this? And I started to do research within my connections and said, I'm going to grow this so that I have a truly diverse group of people that influence me. I'm up today, what is it, 7 months later? I'm up to about 12,000 people. Been adding between 40 to 100 a day. It takes a lot of work. It's not, you know, this isn't for the, you know, this is something if you do, you can do casually, but you have to do it meaningfully if you really want to do it. And what's the most surprising out of it is, and I'm not making this up, I've never been busier. Not just because I'm filling in, you know, constantly interacting with people. I have 2 to 4 conversations a day with people from around the globe as a result of it. People that I never knew before, people whose names I have a hard time pronouncing, you know, shame on me. But, you know, and as a result, 2 weeks ago, I did a webinar in Nepal. 2 weeks before that, I did one in Nigeria. I would have never been doing those. And as a result, it takes me out of my own self-imposed silo. Mm-hmm. And it's also reinforced a few perspectives because I've been listening on others. And one that I'm really fascinated by is the urgency and quality of the conversation about women in leadership internationally. It's just blossoming everywhere. And the beauty of it is women aren't saying, do we have the right to do this? They're doing it. They're just doing it. And they're doing it unapologetically, not forcefully in the, in the way of get out of my way forceful. They're doing it in a way of, who wouldn't want this? Give me an argument why this isn't good kind of perspective. And that's just so impressed me and pleased me and wowed me, because it's actually a conversation, I don't want to say this too harshly, it's actually a conversation I almost feel is happening more directly out of the US than in the US.
Yeah.
Which also is, surprising to those of us who think we're always on the cutting edge of change.
Oh, absolutely. I would agree with you. I wholeheartedly, I would. Well, one of the questions I love to ask my guests is around reading. So I grew up reading, being read to, and it just is a lot of my fondest memories. And so I wanted to ask you, is there a book that you remember from childhood that you either it was read to you, or that a favorite that you read, and kind of, is there, was there a lesson or a takeaway, or even something that you think about today when you think back to that?
Because I don't remember being read to as a child, I'm going to call my therapist right when we're done. But that's a joke. I'll call her later. But it was, I just didn't grow up in a cultural environment. I didn't see a live performance until I was 16.
Wow.
And I became the head of education at the world's largest, cultural center.
Right.
It was almost the absence of a lot of these stimuli that made me realize what I didn't have in my life that I wanted in my life. This isn't anything to brag about, but the first group of books that I read that I deliberately read because I just found them fascinating at the time was the Ian Fleming James Bond series. Mm-hmm. And, now that's not, one you would necessarily, brag about in today's modern society. I'm a James Bond because I'm not.
Right.
But it fascinated me as I was starting to learn about expression, how books and movies and concerts and the like, I just didn't grow up with it. It's not like I grew up in a bad environment or anything. It just was more business-based, finance-based, blue collar, but nevertheless about that than about culture. So I really wasn't read to, in terms of my own kids' books that I loved, reading, were, maybe the common ones, the Sendak and the Little Prince, and something that if you did a case study of them, you would probably say something that asked you. The artist Cezanne said, "Your eyes see the front of a painting, imagination curves to the other side." I'm always interested what that means. How do you get to the other side? What does it look like in an expressed formula or expressed action? I think books like that are trying to say, take in stuff, process it, and come up with a lot more stuff. And through that, you're going to start seeing the world in new ways and be more resourceful in it. That's the curving around to the other side part. So I've always liked books. Growing up, I loved Vonnegut, I loved Robbins, it dates me. But I also loved Tillie Olsen and Adrienne Rich and Annalise Nin. So, there was no one type. But, and some of the more classical writers. But from children's books, it was probably those that had a degree of fantasy. I didn't grow up with sci-fi, by the way. That was not part of my experience. I'm fascinated by it, but it wasn't part of my experience. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. Well, and the other question that I like to ask is around, we've talked about the fact that you had 25 years at Lincoln Center, and you now have a new venture. But what was the very first job or paid task that you ever did as a young person?
My first job was working for my dad. I said he was a blue collar. My dad ran a storm door and awning business. And my brothers and I was the youngest, all kind of started there, pretty much working in the warehouse, loading and unloading trucks or vans. And then after a while, helping, putting, adding screens to storm doors and helping out a little bit in the office. But that was the first job I had. I was 13. I think I made $1 an hour, if that. And my dad made me pay for my own lunch. But I loved it. I loved the job. It was in part because I was interacting with people that in my rest of my daily life, I never interacted with. I mean, there were people who worked there who just had a totally different life experience growing up than I did. And interacting with them and getting to know them and realizing, they were just good people. I mean, even some of them who did stupid things in life, as we all have, were still good people if you stop trying to judge them or put them in their place and you just said, right now that guy knows a hell of a lot more about how to do what we're doing than I do. I better pay attention to him. Not only because I want to do it well, but I could hurt myself if I don't. So I need him right now. He's not just, the guy that, my dad hired to do that. This was, so it was in earnest. And then I got a job working for a auto glass shop, because there's a theme here. And I was very young. I was still in high school. I did that all through high school. And I kind of moved from helping the installers to actually going out on calls. And I learned to drive a stick shift through that job.
That's so fun. Well, so I definitely see what you were talking about in terms of that recognition around kind of our universal qualities, and also paying attention to other people as informing your imagination conversations. Any other bits of those early jobs that you feel like carry through with what you do currently?
My first job out of my undergraduate experience, I had a boss who quite literally would say to me, to go back to the theme of failing well, she would say to me every day, by the end of today, I want you to have failed at least at 3 things. And she would often smile and say, they don't have to be big. And it was her clever, silly, fun, interactive way of saying, part of the job is to do a good job and to be a professional already. And part of the job is to keep learning so that not only do you keep growing so you can take on more responsibility and be better at the responsibility you've taken on, but I want to know how you handle stress and disappointment, because I want to know that you take those things in stride and use them. You don't get crushed by them. And I always appreciate it. I thought you were a little wacky at times, but because it was like, you mean I have to tell you again what I'm doing wrong? Don't I get to brag? I get to brag about the stuff I did bad? That's like, I don't know, that's not the reinforcement I was expecting. But But I certainly understood, the motivation and loved it, because she was basically saying, don't worry about making mistakes, own them and come to me. And she was also giving me permission to say, you don't have to be afraid of telling me that something didn't go as well as it could have. Let's work together to make it go better the next time. And that goes back to once again, it sounds like such a simple theory, but prove and disprove gets us very little. Improve always gets you to a different place. So if you can stop trying to prove and disprove each other and just say, our job is to help improve each other. And as an educator, it's almost, you can't do your job unless that's your perspective. But when you get out into the bloodthirsty real world, you start to feel at times like, it's, you have to lose for me to win. No, that's a purely transactional viewpoint. And it's not the most constructive viewpoint by any means. And most business leaders today realize it, but realizing something and enacting it are not one and the same. And, it's once again, it's harder to do something, my experience, when you tell yourself you're not sure that should be done within my organization. Everybody has to challenge themselves and go to that help improve, not prove or disprove. But so much of as I said, the book I'm working on is about interaction, not transaction, how interaction is equally part of the work experience as transaction. But we pay attention to transaction, not to interaction.
So if you were to suggest one tip or exercise for organizations, and just kind of in a general sense, to increase imagination or to facilitate the use of imagination within an organization, what would that be?
I guess telling them to read imagination first is a cheap way of answering your question, but it is an authentic answer, but cheap. But I would say,
well, where do you start with people who perhaps, let's say, let me put some parameters on it. Let's say that it's a place where, for a group of folks who maybe for whatever reason, the culture hasn't been that supportive of imagination or even creativity within the organization previously, and all of a sudden, they're saying, okay, we want to start thinking differently and bigger, and so what do you do for people who have been trained in such a opposite way?
Yeah, it's the 64 X question again, because the light bulb always has to want to change. I don't know if you ever read, a lot of my work started pre 9/11, but 9/11 was a real catalyst for the work, because the 9/11 report, if you've never read it, or if you have, go back and look at the chapter on imagination. Believe it or not, there's a chapter on imagination, because there's a whole theory in design change, in theory change. They said, which haunted me and still makes me so happy that they said this, which was that 9/11 was a failure of the imagination. And the answer to it in the book was, I'm paraphrasing, but not by much, was we have to learn to routinize, bureaucratize, and institutionalize imagination. I mean, think about that for a second. Routinize, bureaucratize, and institutionalize. It's almost like an oxymoron. You mean to take something that we usually think of as oddball or a little bit, off kilter, and routinize it, bureaucratize it? But that's when I came up with the thought, what they're really saying is we just have to practice it. Mm-hmm. We have to keep practicing it. So what is imagination? Imagination is perceptual capacity, thinking deeply, deep noticing patterns, making connections, being empathetic, taking action, being reflective. All of those are teachable. All those are educable. So whether you do it for self or you do it as an instructor in a learning context, I would always say, go back and try to institutionalize those elements. Don't just tell people the answer. Don't just tell people what to think. Don't just tell people what to do. Let them struggle. Let them find pathways forward, but always make it toward improving, once again, but make it perceptual based. The more you study things that are around you, your environment, the more you notice, the more you take in. I mean, I told you this when we spoke last time. I immediately looked at your own environment and thought, this person has a very keen sense of aesthetic. This person clearly has a sense of design. This person has a really great eye. And those things informed me a lot about you. It doesn't mean that you're, better than anybody else, but they're insights into how you process your world and how you view your world. And when you do those things, you're noticing, you're paying attention, you're taking information in, and that's how you start to become more and more imaginative. And the more you spend time with it, like anything, the more it becomes part of your vocabulary, your lexicon, your way of thinking. There's no mystery around it. That's the beauty of it. I equate it a lot of times with language. We're all born with the capacity for language. Some people learn 84 languages and some never speak more than one. Some people are barely literate and some people become poets. So it's not the capacity or the possibility of it. It's ultimately how it gets developed and reinforced and enhanced within you. But if we could spend more time developing an imaginative capacity for ourselves and for society, maybe we'd solve some of our problems. Maybe we wouldn't hit Monday morning and say, oh, what did we talk about? What was that about? And it's the other image that, that I love is that, as creatures, we stand up on 2 feet. And we're on balance, quite literally. But when you start to get off balance, when you start to lean, you start to need something, or you're literally going to fall. And it's that trust moment right in there. They used to call them trust exercises, but it's that moment when if something else leans into you, you're counterbalanced. If you lean into it, it can be a wall, it can be the floor, it can be another human. But if you think about it without getting corny about it, if you think about when you're no longer upright and dependent on yourself, you're dependent upon something else, there's a whole new range of possibilities because you've added another axis, you've added another formula or set of values to it. And it's through that you can go into all kinds of possibilities that you could never go into if you just do this. So the whole point of it is that you need to practice it for yourself, but then do it with others. Because that's when it starts to, in Imagination First, we talked about pre-pandemic. The goal is to make imagination go viral. Because that's the goal. But once again, there's nothing esoteric, didactic, ephemeral. It's who we are. It's just purely who we are. And it's honoring that and not putting some values on it that if I pay attention to that side of life, I'm a lesser than thinker, or I'm a soft touch thinker, or any of that. It is as concrete and as important as any other value set, if not more so, from my viewpoint.
I would agree wholeheartedly, and I am so grateful for this time today. I am inspired to read Imagination First, and so I will be.
Shameless self-promotion.
Oh my goodness, no! I am very anxious to read it, and I'm looking forward to your next book. So keep us posted, and thank you for learning to swim, and we're going to just keep practice, people. It's worth it.
Yep. Take care. Thank you.
Take care.
Our goal is to inspire others and share stories to find meaning in your daily life. Let go of the traditional norms and be yourself at home, work, and beyond. The awareness of bright spots and blind spots is a performance-enhancing tool that you can apply to your life and to your organization today.